Somewhere around 900,000 years ago, the entire ancestral line that leads to you nearly ran out of people. Not a war, not a single disaster, just a slow, grinding stretch of time where the number of breeding adults dropped so low that your whole future hung on a population smaller than the crowd at a high school football game. Picture it plainly. Scattered clusters of your ancestors, spread thin across a drying African landscape, each group small enough that losing a single bad season could have ended their line for good. None of them knew they were living through the narrowest point your entire species would ever pass through. They were just trying to find water before the next dry stretch hit. And for over a century, nobody studying human origins knew this happened. There was no single fossil that screamed it, no site with a sign pointing to it. Paleoanthropologists digging through layer after layer of ancient soil kept running into the same frustrating problem, a stretch of time where the physical trail of your ancestors seemed to thin out and go quiet, without any obvious explanation for why. The evidence of what actually happened was hiding somewhere far stranger than a dig site. It was sitting inside your own DNA, encoded in a pattern nobody had the tools to read until very recently. Here is the mystery in plain terms. If you look at the fossil record of your ancestors in Africa and Eurasia, there is a stretch between roughly 900,000 and 800,000 years ago where the trail goes strangely quiet. Sites that are packed with stone tools and bones before that window, and after it go thin right in the middle. Paleoanthropologists have noticed this gap for years and argued over what it means. Some assumed it was just bad luck, that the right caves and riverbanks from that time simply hadn't been found yet, buried under 100 feet of later sediment. Others suspected something bigger, something that actually thinned out the population itself, leaving fewer people around to ever become fossils in the first place. Nobody could prove it, because you can excavate a population crash directly. You can only excavate what got left behind, and if there were fewer people to begin with, there's naturally less to dig up. It's the kind of gap that could mean nothing, or could mean your ancestors came within a hair of not making it at all. The proof came from an unexpected direction, and it took decades for the right tool to arrive. In 2023, a team led by geneticists Wangjie Hu, Zihian Hao, and Haipeng Li built a statistical tool called FitCoal, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent, and used it to read the genomes of over 3,000 people alive today, drawn from populations across the globe. Think of it like this. Every person's DNA is a long chain of small changes, mutations, passed down generation after generation like tiny edits, copied from one manuscript to the next. The more breeding adults a population has, the more of these small variations survive and spread, because there are simply more chances for any one of them to get copied forward into the next generation. But when a population crashes down to a small number of people, most of those variations vanish, along with the people who carried them. Only the few variations left in the survivors become the seed for everyone who comes after, which means a bottleneck leaves your entire species with far less genetic variety than you'd expect if the population had just stayed large and stable the whole time. So if you carefully measure how much genetic variation actually exists across a species today, and compare it against how much variation you expect under steady, uninterrupted growth, a population crash leaves behind a very specific, unmistakable fingerprint. Hu and her team ran this analysis and found that exact fingerprint sitting inside the genomes of people alive right now, including yours. Their model pointed to a bottleneck starting around 930,000 years ago and lasting roughly 117,000 years, during which the entire breeding population of your ancestral line dropped to somewhere around 1,280 individuals, not 1,280 per region. 1,280 total, scattered probably across parts of Africa. For comparison, a decent-sized modern high school has more students than that walking its halls at once. The model estimated that this crash may have wiped out somewhere close to 98% of the population that existed before it. And it didn't last a single hard winter. It lasted longer than the entire history of ancient Egypt from its first pharaoh to its last. If this had only shown up in one genetic study, it would be a fascinating claim waiting for confirmation. But it lines up with something else entirely, sitting in rock instead of DNA. Around this same window, roughly 900,000 years ago, the Earth's climate rhythm itself changed gears. For a very long time before this, ice ages had come and gone on a steady 41,000-year cycle, driven by a slow wobble in the tilt of the Earth's axis. But sometime around the period this bottleneck begins, that rhythm shifted into something far harsher. Ice ages roughly every 100,000 years, but colder, longer, and more severe than the ones before. Climate scientists studying ancient ocean sediment cores call this shift the Mid-Pleistocene transition, and it reshaped rainfall patterns across Africa, dragging out droughts and squeezing the water sources your ancestors depended on. A landscape that used to bounce back from a bad dry spell in a few years might now stay parched for centuries. If you were living through that shift with nothing but stone tools, fire, and whatever your body could carry, that kind of prolonged squeeze on food and fresh water is exactly the sort of pressure that can grind a population down generation after generation without a single dramatic event. There's a third piece of this sitting quietly in Europe. A fossil skull found in 1994 near the town of Ceprano in Italy, unearthed by archaeologist Italo Biditu, has been dated to somewhere in this same rough era, and for decades researchers have argued over exactly where it fits on the family tree, because so few fossils from this window exist to compare it against. That argument itself is a kind of evidence. When a species is thriving and spreading, it tends to leave behind a reasonably steady trickle of fossils that specialists can line up in order and largely agree on. When the population crashes to a small, scattered handful of groups, the fossil trail goes thin and confusing, exactly the kind of gap that had puzzled paleoanthropologists long before anyone ran the genetic numbers. So here's what most likely happened, pieced together from a genetics lab, an ocean sediment core, and a single skull from Italy. As the climate rhythm shifted and Africa's dry seasons stretched longer and hit harder, the ancestral population that would eventually lead to you got squeezed down hard. Groups that once ranged across a wide, connected landscape found themselves isolated in shrinking pockets wherever water and food still held out. Some of those pockets simply couldn't hang on and disappeared. The ones that survived stayed small, isolated, and fragile for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, likely over 100,000 years, before conditions eased enough for the population to slowly recover and expand again. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This isn't ancient trivia with no bearing on you today. Geneticists have long known that humans, as a species, have unusually low genetic diversity compared to other primates. Two chimpanzees living in neighboring troops in the same forest can be more genetically different from each other than you are from someone born on the opposite side of the planet. For a long time, that was just a strange fact about our species without a clean explanation. A bottleneck like this one gives it a mechanism. When you compress an entire population down to roughly 1,200 breeding individuals for over 100,000 years, you don't just lose people, you lose genetic variety, and that shortage echoes forward through every single generation that follows, all the way down to the DNA sitting in your own cells right now. So the next time you notice how similar humans are to each other worldwide, in blood type, in disease resistance, in the sheer genetic sameness that lets a bone marrow donor from one continent save a stranger's life on another, you're looking at the fingerprint of a squeeze. Your ancestors barely survived 900,000 years ago. It's also part of why, despite there being billions of you spread across every continent on Earth, your species carries less raw genetic variety than a single troop of chimpanzees living in one forest. That's not a flaw. It's a scar, quietly written into every cell in your body, left by 100,000 years spent as one of the rarest, most fragile populations that has ever existed. Your existence isn't the result of some grand, inevitable march of evolution steadily rolling forward on autopilot. It's the result of a small, stubborn handful of people, likely no more than a few thousand at the lowest point, who kept finding just enough water and just enough food to make it to the next generation for 100,000 years straight, without ever knowing they were the last thread connecting the deep past to you.